All right, welcome back. This is the next lecture for AP Government. Today we're looking at Congress. So this is our next sort of major topic. All right. Just a little heads up. We'll look at Congress. We'll look at some financial issues, a little bit more economics in this unit, and then we'll look at some policy stuff as well as it pertains to Congress. Our next unit is the presidency, bureaucracy, and foreign policy. And that's it. We're done. That's the entire semester right there. So our Congress is a bicameral legislature. That means that we have two chambers. We have the House of Representatives, and then we have the Senate. And so let's start sort of just looking at who these people are. So theoretically, it's not a glamorous job. That's probably more true of the House of Representatives. There's 435 of them. My guess is you would be hard pressed to name, I would imagine five. I think five is probably more representatives than you could name. My guess is some of you could probably name more than five senators. There's only 100 of them, and they do have a little bit more prestige and clout. But regardless, you wield a significant amount of political power, which is then just sort of power in general, because obviously politics is what controls everything. You make a really hefty salary for working less than what a teacher does. 174 is actually on the low end. So that's like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez makes $174,000 a year. She's been in Congress for 2 years now. They also get health benefits, some generous retirement, although retirement does require they have to meet like basic timelines in terms of retirement. You don't get to serve 2 years in the House of Representatives and then pull like some massive pension for the remainder of your life. The constitutional requirements for the House of Representatives: you have to be 25 years of age. You have to have been a citizen for 7 years, and then you have to reside in the district that you represent, and actually inside the district, right? So Kathleen Wall, if that name rings a bell for you, she was one of the Republican primary candidates for our district's seat. 2 years ago, she ran in the Texas 2nd District and ultimately lost in the primary to a guy named Dan Crenshaw, who's now a fairly prominent representative, although he kind of got his initial fame because he wears an eye patch. He's a former Navy SEAL who lost an eye, so it was an eye patch. And Pete Davidson made fun of him on Saturday Night Live, kind of infamously. But Kathleen Wall lived in the 2nd District, which is sort of North Houston, and then moved to our district in order to try to win a congressional seat because Pete Olson was retiring. So obviously you can move around relatively easily. In the Senate, you have to be 30. You have to be a resident of the United States for 9 years, and then obviously you have to reside again within the state in which you represent. Now, and this is true for all of them. Like most of them will have apartments in Washington, D.C. They'll have sort of a semi-permanent residence in D.C., but they have to maintain a permanent residence where in the area in which they represent, right? So Ted Cruz, for instance, his permanent home is actually in I believe it's actually in Houston proper, meaning it's actually within the city limits. But he's a Houston guy. So this is a portrait of the 115th Congress, and the 115th Congress is 2016, I believe. So like obviously we're a little out of date here, but it's hard to sort of keep on top of these numbers because they change every 2 years. But I'm pretty sure this is from the 2017. Right. The new Congress, so the Congress is elected in even years, and then they actually take office January 3rd of odd numbered years. So But this is just some of the sort of stereotypical background or breakdown of these people, by race, gender. You're welcome to pause this and sort of look at it if you so desire. And then this is the sort of common occupation, right? That being said, so this is Senator Capito from West Virginia, the old woman in the middle of the picture, just in case you were unclear as to which one of these people would be Shelley. The sort of idea behind a photo like this is just to show you, obviously, that sort of the majority of our senators and representatives are white people, but obviously they represent vastly different backgrounds, whether it's racially or ethnically or religiously or whatever, right? If you go back and again you look at the statistics, you know that significantly more men are in Congress than women. Significantly more men run for Congress than women do. I kind of jokingly say that they work less than teachers, and that's true. Congress is in session less than what teachers work. But actually being a congressman is a long, sort of exhaustive job. A congressman's day could start as early as 6 a.m., and they could be working until past midnight. I think that there's probably a little bit of sort of bias in terms of gender roles. Men are generally willing to put in those grueling hours more so than women. Women obviously have sort of competing responsibilities with things like child care. So if you have a woman that is that is, has children, especially smaller children, it becomes increasingly difficult for them. Some people will tell you that there's inherent bias, and maybe there probably is bias. Again, just because I think we have a tendency to believe that men will or are willing to work longer and harder and more grueling hours than what we think women will. There's certainly some bias in terms of who we think is more, who has the correct temperament. That's probably the right word that I want to use in terms of who should be elected. I don't know that you really have to say that women have to be more qualified. And I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is probably a really good example. Not to claim that she's not qualified. I mean, she has she double majored. She has bachelor's degrees in economics and economics and philosophy. I don't know, economics and something else. But I mean, she was fairly qualified. She worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 before running for herself in 2018. Was she as qualified as some people that are in Congress? Absolutely not. But in reality, the House of Representatives, there's not a lot of qualifications for it. I mean, Troy Nehls is likely to be our congressman, and he's a police officer. Val Demings, Democrat from Orlando, is former chief of police before she became a congresswoman. So I don't know that you think women necessarily have to be more qualified. Again, I mean, Demings and Troy Nehls are probably not that different. But women are less likely to be in Congress. And again, there's probably some, long-standing bias about that. But also you have more men run. You have more men. And when you look at qualifications, you have more men that hold higher degrees. I mean, so there's certainly like historical aspects that are behind that. Because in reality, I mean, you look at sort of my parents' generation as an example, and women were not afforded the same sort of educational opportunities as what men were. All right, congressional elections. So we're going to look through all of this real quick. We'll talk about all of these different concepts. First, who wins elections? The answer is the incumbent. The incumbent That's a vocab term you need to know. The incumbent is the guy that's already in office. They are going to win. If they are already there, they are going to win, especially in the House of Representatives, because we have something called gerrymandering in the House of Representatives, and we'll have a day dedicated to that concept, so you can sort of understand what gerrymandering is. But the incumbent is generally going to be reelected, which is a little comical considering we have an incredibly low approval for Congress. A few years ago, Congress's approval rating was single digits. Single digits, and yet over 90% of the House of Representatives gets reelected every 2 years. For the Senate, it's not quite as easy, just because the Senate votes obviously as the state as a whole is voting for the Senate. So you have a larger constituency base. You have more people that you have to appease. So it's not quite as high for the Senate, but incumbents generally win re-election in the Senate as well. Incumbents, another one of the sort of incumbent advantages is they can generally significantly outraise their opponents. They're capable of raising significantly larger sums of money, and they seek to raise significantly larger sums of money through political action committees, because they think, I mean, I guess they think they're vulnerable. The reality is, here's sort of the cynical answer, right? Like you guys have figured out by now, I'm kind of cynical when it comes to government from time to time. The real answer is when you become a congressman, ultimately your number one job after you've been elected to Congress is to keep a job, right? Because we all want job security, right? I don't want to wake up tomorrow and find out that George Ranch has fired me. So we all want job security. For congressmen, in order to have that job security, that means they have to continue to win re-election. And one of the ways they do that is through significant sums of money. So they're going to be fundraising like it is their job. And they're capable of fundraising significantly more than their opponents. This is just a graph over the course of time on how often the incumbent is reelected. And you just need to understand that with this sort of incumbency concept, those people that are in office and running for re-election are the only ones that count in this. And so this, and I also need you to understand, because this graph's kind of small, or the numbers are kind of small, so it's a little misleading. But I need you to understand that, like, on the y-axis, the y-axis is the vertical axis, right? Yeah, pretty sure it is. So on the y-axis, it starts obviously at 0, and then immediately jumps to 55. So, like, I need you to realize that at no point in time are less than half of our senators being reelected. Like, at no point in time, ever. And that's the Senate. The House is way up there at the top and barely ever dips under, like, 90. So some of the incumbents have significant advantages, right? So one is advertising. They're actually allowed to contact constituents. Constituents, that's another vocab term that you need to know because it'll come up throughout this unit. Constituents are the people that a congressman represents, right? So we are the constituents of Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, John Cornyn, Pete Olson, Phil Stevenson, Greg Abbott, like anybody that's elected to represent us in any capacity. We're their constituents. In Congress, constituents can actually mail things home for free. It's called the franking privilege, so that they can keep the people informed of what they're doing. In reality, they're just like, hey, vote for me because I'm awesome and this is what I've done for you. And then when I say what I've done for you, they claim credit for all sorts of things. And so two of those are casework. Casework is basically favors for constituents, right? So let's just say for the sake of argument, you become famous one day and you need to leave the country very quickly for some concert or some whatever, right? So you have to leave. You can and you only have like a couple of days to do it, and you don't have a passport. You can call your congressman. Your congressman can get you a passport in like 48 hours, right? If you go down to the post office and get your little picture taken and mail it off, it takes weeks. That's sort of the concept of casework, right? Doing like favors for your individual constituents. Pork barrel projects is another one. So pork barrel is basically money, federal money that comes into the district, which stimulates economic growth and provides jobs and stuff like that. And so the congressmen are like, "Hey, look what I'm doing for you," which is a little ridiculous because sometimes it's things like the bridge to nowhere, right? Because years and years ago, like you can actually Google this. Since you're sitting in front of a computer, I suggest you do that. But like Google bridge to nowhere, because I'm pretty sure, oh, I don't know, it's maybe 10 years ago now, but there was like a bridge that they built in Alaska that cost something like $60 million to build a bridge in Alaska to a little Alaskan island that had like 100 inhabitants. Like 100 people lived on the island. But we built them a bridge for $60 million or whatever it was. I don't remember the numbers. You can look the numbers up. But that's pork. Okay. Weak opponents. Opponents are generally a little bit weaker. They don't have name recognition. They don't have some of those same sort of advantages. A lot of the times they don't have the backing of like the party or major donors or anything like that. Like they just, when we say weak, they don't have sort of the same resources that the incumbent has. The incumbent can drastically outspend the challenger because again they generally like raise way more money. And then party identification is an incumbency advantage because you look at gerrymandering, and generally seats are what we call safe seats, right? The big dig here. This is just an example of sort of pork that goes through Boston. So where you had basically a major highway that ultimately ends up sort of becoming a tunnel so that the city can be prettier because that's what everybody wants in life is a pretty city. In order to defeat incumbents, so why do people challenge? One, sometimes it's naive. They don't really know what they're getting into. Sometimes one of the ways that you can really defeat an incumbent is to primary them out, right? To defeat them in a primary. That's how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got her job. She defeated, oh, I forget the guy's name now, but he was like a 10-term congressman from New York City. He was one of the more powerful Democrats in the House of Representatives, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat him in a primary to basically take his seat from him. Some of the things that can actually help challengers, though, obviously scandals can play a significant impact in it. Although there was a senator from New Jersey a couple of years ago who was literally under indictment, meaning he was like being prosecuted by the national government, got reelected. So sometimes scandal doesn't matter that much. I mean, clearly we didn't care about Donald Trump and his porn star scandal thing. Nobody really cared about Bill Clinton and all of his affairs. I mean, scandals, it makes a lot of news, but it doesn't necessarily always sway the outcome of an election. Redistricting can be significant, though. Every 10 years, this is a constitutional requirement. Every 10 years, we conduct a census. We actually just finished that. And that data should be made public here in a couple of months. And we will find out how many more seats in the House of Representatives the state of Texas gets. Texas will probably pick up another 3 or maybe 4 seats in the House of Representatives again. And then we'll have to redistrict because now we've got 4 more seats or 3 more seats or however many more we've got. And so we've got to redraw some lines. And so that basically sort of creates instances of it creating open seats and things like that. And then you have wave elections. And so that's the sort of the concept of somebody riding the coattails of a president, right? So Barack Obama got black people to come out and vote in massive numbers in 2008. And so with that, we're like, hey, we're going to vote Obama in. We should probably vote some other Democrats in too, because that's the only way Obama's going to get anything done. So that helps. When you have an open seat, that means no incumbent is running, and this is actually the the tightest race, right? Like the most volatile, the most sort of the type of race that could go in either direction, right? Most competitive. That's the word I'm looking for. Good grief, most competitive type of election. In fact, the most really you really want to get like real typical. The most competitive election would be an open Senate seat in a swing state, right? So if you had an open Senate seat in Florida or North Carolina or Ohio, those would be pretty competitive. But even if you look, I mean, just like turn the television on here, and you will see because we have an open seat. Pete Olson is not going back to Congress; he's quitting, and so we have Troy Nehls running against Sheree Preston Kulkarni. And there's a significant amount of advertising going into it on both sides, from both groups, from other groups that are advocating for or against them, simply because this is an open seat, and that open seat concept is something where both sides feel like they have a legitimate chance at winning this election. So. Open seats are significantly more competitive than other types of elections. There is some good thing or some good concepts behind sort of the incumbency advantage. You do have some stability as a result of incumbents getting reelected all the time, and with that stability also comes expertise. So, a lot of people that get elected, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is probably a good example. Get elected, you have all these grand ideas of things that you can do that are ultimately just grossly unrealistic. Or sometimes you think about doing things that are only theoretical, and once you get to Congress, and you sort of realize that doesn't happen. It's no longer feasible. So the expertise aspect, the stability aspect, those are probably advantages of incumbency. That being said, I don't know that it's a positive that you have sort of Congress for life. When you look at Strom Thurmond, for instance, Strom Thurmond was first elected to the Senate in 1954, and that dude was serving in the Senate until 2002. Like that's a little ridiculous. There are no term limits to Congress. It's actually unconstitutional. There was a Supreme Court case, Thornton v. Arkansas, maybe. Don't remember it off the top of my head, but there was a Supreme Court case that limited, there was a state trying to set term limits onto congressional seats, and the Supreme Court declared that to be unconstitutional. So, people can run over and over forever and ever and ever, amen, because that's just what they're allowed to do. So now let's get into actual policy making for Congress and how stuff actually gets done, because that's probably what really matters as far as Congress goes for this unit. And so the first thing I'm gonna ask you is, before we even move on to the next slide, I want to just say this out loud to yourself, right? Is Congress efficient? No, I agree. They're not. They're not at all, right? Now I'm going to ask you, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So you're wrong. It's a good thing. We don't want an efficient Congress. And we're going to talk about that right now so that we understand that concept. So here's how Congress sort of actually does things, right? We have a bicameral legislature, right? Bicameralism is actually something that's in the Constitution. And so we have the House of Representatives that is elected by the people. Then we have the Senate that originally is appointed by the state legislatures. We now directly elect the Senate as well. But the House serves for every 2 years. They're all reelected every 2 years. The Senate serves for 6 years. There's a difference in the two chambers. And the Senate is actually supposed to sort of stop things and slow things down. Like that's actually the the idea behind the Senate. Like the Senate is meant to cool sort of a hot house, right? So there's some checks and balances within the House and the Senate themselves. Or the House is, like I said, it's two-year terms. There's 435 people in the House. Therefore, it's very structured and rigid. There's a lot of rules. There's actually an entire rules committee. There's very formalized procedures over debate and who talks and when they talk and how long people can talk and all that stuff. The Senate is far less structured, and it's more informal. Because again, if you had 435 people sort of all yelling at one time, you wouldn't get a whole lot accomplished. Whereas the Senate is significantly smaller in its numbers, so you don't need sort of the same concept, right? Like think about it in class. We have in class discussions, and there's 20, 25 of us, however many there are in class. We're very informal. We're like the Senate, right? You just kind of talk whenever you want. Maybe one of you raises your hand until it's really tired and you wait on me to call you because you're just a little bit more civil than the rest. But we're able to sort of just talk sort of a more informal conversational manner. But if we were to actually take this class at like a freshman level in a college where you have 200 people sitting in a large lecture hall, can you have that same informal conversation? Of course you couldn't, right? So the House is the House and the Senate are structured very differently. These are just some of the actual like constitutional differences. Well, some of them are constitutional. Some of them are procedural and have been established through the rules of the individual chambers, right? So obviously, term limits, or excuse me, not limits. The term of office, right? The 2 years or 6 years. That's set up by the Constitution. But when you look at sort of like procedures, right? The House is very structured in their procedures. The Senate allows for unlimited debate. The Senate will actually talk about this in a little bit, but the Senate has something called the filibuster. So it's far less structured, far less nuanced than what the House of Representatives. That's why the most sort of powerful person in all of Congress is the Speaker of the House, because the House leadership, because there's more people for them to lead, they wield a little bit more power than what Senate leadership does, right? So looking at leadership's chosen by the party, right? So in the House of Representatives, you have the Speaker of the House. That person is the head of the House of Representatives. They are a member of whatever party controls the House. Then both parties have a Speaker of the House, or excuse me, have a majority leader or a minority leader. So they both have an official leader. The majority leader is obviously the guy who's in the majority party. The minority leader is the person who's in the minority party. And then each party has something called a whip. The whips are basically, their job is to do exactly what it sounds like somebody called a whip would do. They beat membership into submission, right? So when you look at the Senate, because the Senate has the same thing, right? Mitch McConnell wants to get Amy Coney Barrett confirmed, and you got a whole bunch of Republican senators that are like, I don't know about this. I don't think it's a very good idea. John Cornyn, who's the whip, who's Mitch McConnell's whip, goes around and starts beating these people into submission, being like, you gonna vote yes, you gonna vote yes, you gonna vote yes. And they can do that because they wield a significant amount of power. Because if you don't sort of play ball, if you don't toe the party line, they'll get you out. Like they'll vote you out. They'll primary you out. They'll figure out how to get somebody else in there that will support the party. They're not going to switch sides. They're not going to be like, "Ooh, you a terrible Republican down there in Texas, so we're going to support the Democrat." No, they'll find a different Republican to run against you. So these guys, that's Paul Ryan on the left, who's the former Speaker of the House, back when the Republicans controlled things. And then that's Mitch McConnell in the middle. Hopefully you know the turtle. And Chuck Schumer on the right, who is the Senate Minority Leader. So this would have been leadership for the 115th Congress, or after 2016, when the Republicans still controlled the House of Representatives. Committees and subcommittees, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know what types of committees exist. So there's four different types. There's standing committees. Standing committees are committees that exist all the time, right? They're there all the time. You have joint committees. Joint committees are committees comprised of both senators and representatives. You have conference committees. Conference committees are convened to to reconcile the difference between legislation in the House and the Senate. So if the House passes, let's say the House passes a stimulus bill and the Senate passes a slightly different stimulus bill, it'll go to a conference committee, again comprised of members of both the House and the Senate. They'll work together to find sort of a compromise, and then it goes back to both chambers for another vote. Because you have to pass, in order for it to go to the president, you have to pass the exact same bill, like word for word, exact same bill in both chambers. If there's even one change, it ends up in conference committees. Select committees are committees that are created to deal with a very specific purpose. And so they're usually temporary. They're created to deal with some issue, and then they're dissolved once that issue has been addressed. Okay, all members of Congress are on committees. In the House, you might only be on one committee. In the Senate, you serve on multiple committees just because there's so few people, right? Like if you paid attention to the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings, there were 23 senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Like that's like a quarter of the entire Senate, right, on one committee. And then there's still like the Appropriations Committee and the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, and there's all kinds of committees. So you serve on multiple committees just because in the Senate you're more of a sort of policy generalist, whereas the House is more policy specialists. They serve on like one committee because that's the committee that they're sort of responsible for. You want to be on committees, so not all committees are equal. Some committees wield more power than other committees, but ultimately you want to be on a committee that can be beneficial to your constituents, right? So if you're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, probably would not be beneficial to her or her constituents if she ended up on the House Agricultural Committee, because the girl lives in like the Bronx or wherever, and there's no agriculture there, like none, right? On the other hand, if you are the representative, you're a representative from like Kansas or Nebraska, like the Agricultural Committee is probably for you. Okay? The chairman of committees are basically where everything gets done now in Congress. So committee chairmen wield significant power. Used to be that the chairmen were whoever was senior in the committee. There's been some rule changes over the course of time, and that's not necessarily true anymore. But it still predominantly goes off the seniority system. Okay. Caucuses, this is an informal organization within Congress. So it's basically, a caucus is basically a group of people. So you have, for instance, like you have the Congressional Black Caucus, which all black Congress members are a part of. Now, obviously, most of our, I probably don't need to tell you this, but most of our black Congress members are Democrats. But you do have, what's his name? Tim Scott, I think is his name, from South Carolina, who's a black Republican. But he would still be welcome in the Black Caucus. Now, ironically, if you were a white dude who happened to be the representative of, like, I don't know, a predominantly black community, they won't let you in the black caucus, even though you represent black people. So, I mean, that's just sort of how caucuses work. Like they have their own membership. There's tons of caucuses. There's some traditional ones like the Black Caucus. There's now like the Women's Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus. But there's also things like the Freedom Caucus, which was basically created by a bunch of Tea Party dudes that are promoting their sort of Tea Party agenda, right? So there's an image of the Hispanic Caucus from 2016, I believe. Congressional staff. Every congressman has their own staff. The staff is fairly significant, or it's fairly substantial. Excuse me. They'll do a lot of the personal work for the congressman. They'll do a lot of the casework for congressmen specifically. So they're the ones running around doing the things that help the individual constituents, so that the congressman can look good. It's beneficial for the staff for the congressman to look good, because there's no guarantee that they would stay on staff if the congressman were to be voted out or changed. It's not like you are staff for the 22nd District of Texas. You are staff for Representative Pete Olson. So Olson retires, you basically are now, interviewing for a job again. The staff also engages in a significant amount of actual, like, congressional work. It's a little sad, but congressmen, even though their job is to literally write laws, they don't write laws anymore. Like, Congress doesn't write legislation pretty much at all. Not only do they not write the legislation, but they don't even really look over it anymore. A lot of that is done by their staff, which is why their staff is so important, because their staff reports out on various pieces of legislation. They write legislation. They help conduct oversight. Again, if you were to ever watch a congressional committee, one of the things that you would find in watching a congressional committee is every congressman has people behind them that are constantly, like, passing them notes and providing them with information and details about various things, because that's what the staff does. They are instrumental to congressmen. All right, lawmaking process. So how does a bill become a law? Obviously, this graphic is very small and it's hard to read. But I do need you to understand, and this is where we get into this concept, like, is Congress efficient? The answer is no. Because if you were to look at this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 steps. 14 steps in order for a bill to become a law, and depending on how you identify those steps, 14 is probably a decent number. That's a lot. And the problem is in order for a bill to become a law, you have to have 14 yeses, right? Like 14 yeses. One no, and you're done, right? If there's one no out of these 14, it kills it, and the process is done, okay? So the lawmaking process is not sort of an efficient process, right? We don't want, and here's the thing, we don't want lawmaking to be efficient. I don't want laws to be passed quickly, because that means we pass all sorts of reactionary laws that are ultimately detrimental, right? So agendas, the agendas are actually set by the House and the Senate themselves. They set their own agendas. The House has the Rules Committee, which basically sets their agenda. The Senate Majority Leader sets their own agenda. The committee chairman, they sort of do their own thing. But when legislation, so the way it works is when you write legislation, it gets assigned to a committee, and then really it goes to a lot of the times it'll go to a subcommittee within that committee, and they read it and they sort of report on it, and they sort of look it over and do some of the math and the numbers, and will this work or won't this work or whatever. And then it can go to the committee, and then only if it gets a favorable report from the committee can it go to the floor. And then once it goes to the floor managers are trying to help get the bill passed at a whole. Oversight is a different sort of committee responsibility. Oversight simply means watching the government. So it's keeping tabs on what the executive branch is doing, to include the bureaucracy. There's not a lot of incentive for members of Congress to do this. Some members of Congress care significantly about oversight. Others kind of don't. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, again, because she's a little bit more idealistic, seems to. There was a Republican congressman named Trey Gowdy from South Carolina who was sort of famous or infamous or whatever word you want to use, but well known for his oversight interrogations of the bureaucracy and of the executive branch for how they did things. But the sort of agenda for oversight is determined by Congress, by whoever's in charge of Congress, because they're the ones that are sort of setting the idea and the policy. And so when you go and you watch, again, sort of legislative oversight, and you watch somebody like James Comey being called in before Congress, when the Republicans, when they sort of question him, it's very hard-hitting questions about why didn't you charge Hillary, yada yada yada, and then the Democrats ask drastically different things, because obviously they're not interested in the whole Hillary saga, right? So this is a committee, an oversight committee hearing. I do want to call attention to the woman in the background. That's part of that staff. That's somebody who's passing information on to the congressman there. The floor debate. So once it goes to the floor, obviously in the House, there's very strict rules about what happens on the floor. The Senate is very different. So on the Senate, they do have a concept called the filibuster. And it's probably important for you to understand that right now, because the filibuster is dying. And it's probably, my guess is, if the Democrats win the White House and the Senate next week, when they take over the Senate in January, my guess is that they will completely kill the filibuster within the first 2 weeks. They started, like, they basically fired the first shot to kill the filibuster, and then the Republicans fired another shot, and this is one of those things where it drives me crazy, because Congress really just clearly doesn't understand that you can't do something. You can't change the line, right? Like, you can't draw a new line in the sand, and then when you're not in power, complain that the other side also draws a new line in the sand. So the filibuster, basically, the way it worked is a congressman would take the floor, or a senator specifically would take the floor, and they just wouldn't give it up. They would keep talking, and talking, and talking. And it did get to the point once where sort of the filibuster, like, even if you threatened to filibuster, and the other side didn't have 60 votes to get cloture, which stops a filibuster, they wouldn't even put it on the agenda, because they didn't want to deal with the filibuster. So, I mean, just a threat of a filibuster sometimes was enough to kill some pieces of legislation. There are some relatively famous filibusters in the course of history. Ted Cruz, years ago, was filibustering. It might have been the Affordable Care Act, honestly. But he was filibustering and read Green Eggs and Ham on the floor of the Senate, the long version of Green Eggs and Ham on the floor of the Senate. There have been other senators that have read the dictionary. The record for the longest filibuster in Senate history is, I believe, roughly 25 consecutive hours. Dude spoke for 25 straight hours. Yeah. So it's a tool of the minority, the filibuster is, because they're trying to stop things. But for the longest time, we liked it because it prevented the Senate from just sort of railroading through stuff all the time. And it did provide that minority an opportunity to sort of stall things out and try to get things, we're trying to prevent things from being accomplished that were ultimately detrimental. Rand Paul has actually filibustered a few times. Famously tried to eat like a Snickers once in the middle of a filibuster, and it did not go well for him which maybe if you follow political commentary, it was kind of funny. Legislating has now become more difficult, and it's significantly difficult in this day and age because we live in the era of divided government. And with divided government and hyperpartisanship, it becomes really difficult to get things done. Party leaders, like the leaders in Congress, are now more heavy-handed. They do more. They deal with more, trying to get their party to again sort of behave the correct way. I mean, anymore now, and this is probably more true about Republicans. Republicans that are willing to work with Democrats and compromise from time to time are almost ostracized by their own people. They're called rhinos, which stands for Republican in name only, RINO. And they're ostracized for compromising, which is what the whole system is sort of built on. But now you basically have all sorts of things that occurred almost entirely or solely across party lines. Some other people that have an impact or an influence on it. The president can. So the president will have a legislative agenda. He generally puts forth to Congress a whole bunch of things that he wants done, and then Congress tries to get that done. The president only wields so much political capital, so there's only so much that he can get accomplished. And Congress is generally independent. And just because the president asks for something doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to get whatever it is that he wants. But Obamacare is probably a good example. Like, obviously, we call it Obamacare, yet Congress is clearly the ones who had to pass it. Yes, it was Obama's sort of idea, but he's passing it. The party can influence it. So the party's policies, the party platform, can help impact sort of legislative goals. Ideology impacts legislative goals. So how sort of polarized are we? Are we in one of those rare 2-year windows where there's sort of unified government and you can get some stuff done? And then constituencies, their opinion matters. Now, there is something that you need to understand here, because congressmen operate basically into two different roles. One is a delegate role and one is a trustee role. In the delegate role, constituencies matter. Because there the individual should be doing what the constituency tells them to do. Whereas the trustee role is really the congressman sort of voicing their own opinion or voting how they want, and basically telling the constituency, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Like, I'm better informed than you are, right? I have access to classified information that you don't, that I know means that I should vote this way. And if you knew what I knew, you also would vote this way. This just shows you some of the increases in ideology. There's another little sort of video that I'm going to put out. It's like a minute and a half, that will help you understand that concept as well. And then lobbyists and interest groups, they're constantly trying to get Congress to pass legislation that is beneficial for what it is that they want, right? And we talked about lobbyists in a significant amount of detail already, so I'm going to sort of gloss over this one. So then understanding Congress and sort of how it works. Democracy, we don't have true democracy. We have representative democracy. Congress is that representative democracy. Although it's not representative in a number of different ways. Our congressmen are a bunch of elites. The average wealth of a congressman is well over $1 million. Well over $1 million. The unrepresentative nature of, or the unequal representative nature of the Senate is obviously detrimental to sort of the concept of democracy. So there's all sorts of issues in terms of that concept. And this graphic right here gives you sort of the idea of malapportionment, right? And so malapportionment means unequal representation, right? So like Wyoming, again, for instance, they have 2 senators and like 500,000 people. And California has 2 senators and 40 million people. which is obviously a gross sort of misjustice. And then finally, sort of Congress and the general scope of government. So government has continued to increase, and part of the reason for it is sort of congressional action, or on some level congressional inaction, because Congress has allowed the bureaucracy to do a whole lot, and it's sort of a catch 22, because we say that we don't like government, we say that we don't want big government, yet we all want our individual programs, we all want the things that government gives us, right? Like we all want our governmental grants and our student loans that aren't like our student grants, like money from the federal government that we don't have to pay back. We all want peace and prosperity from a national defense. Like we all want safety and security with the police force. Like we all want all of these things. Yet, and that's government, yet we claim that we don't like government. And so Congress is sort of in this awkward position of how do they appease the people by keeping government small and giving people everything that they want. And so it becomes very contradictory for Congress. It's very difficult for Congress to grasp that. And so one of the things that they've done is they've sort of given up authority over the course of time and allowed the bureaucracy to do more. That way, when the things go well, congressmen can sort of take the credit for them. But when they go poorly, then congressmen will turn around and be like, "Well, that's the bureaucracy. That's not us. Like we didn't do that." Okay. So that brings us to the end of Congress. So that's the end of this unit. We will move forward at some point in time next week with monetary and fiscal policy, or wait, no, maybe it's social policy. It's congressional policy. We'll move forward with congressional policy next.